Hello everyone, I'm Ixalan, and right now it is Rivals of Ixalan Limited Review Week on my channel. The whole set was spoiled yesterday, of course, and that means for a whole week I'll be talking about the new cards in the context of Limited. Yesterday I talked about all the white cards in the set, and today we're looking at blue. I'm going to cover every card in the set by the end of the week, as well as doing an archetype guide and my picks for the biggest bombs and best commons and uncommons in the set. If you want to know how I grade cards for these reviews, you can follow a link in the description below that discusses that. Now, let's look at the first blue card in Rivals of Ixalan. The first card is Admiral's Order, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a rare instant, and it has Raid. If you attack with a creature this turn, you may pay blue rather than pay this spell's mana cost. Raid is always just an additional effect if you attacked with a creature on that turn, and it says counter target spell. This card has a cool design. It's basically cancel with a bunch of upside. If the format is anything like Triple Ixalan was, being able to interact during combat is a big deal, and this can help you avoid getting blown out by a Skullduggery, to an extent. The problem it has is that it will only ever cost a single blue during your own turn, because obviously you can't attack with creatures during your opponent's turn, and being able to counter a combat trick on your opponent's turn for 1 mana is more important. In the end, I don't think this card is anything special. Sometimes you really get your opponent who decides to cast an instant speed removal spell after you declare your attackers, but most of the time this is just going to be canceled. A card that is usually only barely playable in most limited formats, and I'm going to give this a C-. Next, we have Aquatic Incursion, which for 3 generic and 1 blue is an uncommon enchantment, and it says, when Aquatic Incursion enters the battlefield, create 2 1/1 blue merfolk creature tokens with hexproof. It also has an activated ability that costs 3 generic and 1 blue, and it says, target merfolk can't be blocked this turn. This card is kind of underwhelming to me. 4 mana for 2 1/1 tokens isn't great, hexproof or not, and sure, the ability to make one of your merfolk unblockable in the later part of the game is nice, but it comes at a pretty steep cost as well, 4 mana. It isn't bad by any means, just a sort of average card for being an uncommon that is supposed to help support one of the tribes. I'm going to give it just a straight C. You'll play it in your merfolk decks, but it isn't going to be a card that steals games for you or anything, or really a linchpin in the merfolk decks at all. Next, we have Crafty Cutpurse, which for 3 generic and 1 blue is a 2/2 human pirate at rare. It has flash, and it says when Crafty Cutpurse enters the battlefield, each token that would be created under an opponent's control this turn is created under your control instead. This definitely feels like a card that was printed more for Constructed to keep token decks in check, but it isn't completely useless in this format where there are cards that make tokens, and all of the major tribes. Vampires like making tokens, merfolks like making tokens, we just saw some, and dinosaurs like making tokens too, although a little less than the other two, and pirates don't really make pirate tokens for the most part. They make treasure, though, and you can also steal that with this. My feeling is that if you were able to cast this and steal 1 token, even if it's just a treasure, it's probably doing its job. If you're able to steal more than 1, you're going to feel really good, but don't expect that to happen too often. I think as a main board card, this is probably something like a D. Against most opponents, they just won't have enough ways to make tokens for this to be worth it. However, if you see a few different token generators, it is a pretty good card to be bringing out of your sideboard, which means I think it's about a B- out of your sideboard. Next, we have Crashing Tide, which for 2 generic and 1 blue is a common sorcery that says, Crashing Tide has flash as long as you control a merfolk. Return target creature to its owner's hand. Draw a card. This is a good common. 3 mana for a sorcery speed bounce effect that comes with a cantrip is already playable. That's something like a C. But it can become instant speed if you fulfill a pretty easy to fulfill criterion, controlling a merfolk. I think it is a C in a deck that doesn't have enough merfolk, and probably a C+ in a deck that has enough of them. I could even see it getting maybe into the B- range. Being instant speed is a huge boost, as it lets you interact with your opponent's creatures during combat, bounce things that your opponents are trying to put auras on or use combat tricks on, and so forth. Next, we have Curious Obsession, which for 1 blue is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature gets +1/+1, and as whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. It also says at the beginning of your end step, if you didn't attack with a creature this turn, sacrifice Curious Obsession. This is a curious card, and indeed it's a callback to the card Curiosity. The stat boost it gives and the effect it grants are pretty good value for 1 mana, but it does force you to attack every turn or you lose the aura. Also, unless your deck has a good number of evasive creatures, drawing cards consistently and always being able to attack isn't something you can guarantee. I think this is a C- in most decks, but I do have one caveat. If your deck has a lot of flyers in it, Curious Obsession is actually going to be really good. Flyers doesn't seem to be a really super consistent archetype here, even in blue-white. But so I'm not really going to give it like a separate grade, but I will just say if you have a lot of evasive creatures, Curious Obsession does get to be better than a C-. Next up, we have Deadeye Rig Hauler, which for 3 generic and 1 blue is a common human pirate with raid. And again, that means you just have to have attacked with something and you get this effect. And it says, if you attacked with a creature this turn, you may return target creature to its owner's hand. And that's when it enters the battlefield. I love this card. I love Mana War, and if you've been watching me for a while, you know that. You know I love bouncing opponents' creatures. The tempo it gives is amazing, and this one is very good. When it was originally spoiled, for some reason I thought it was an uncommon, and I was ready to say, well, this is one of the best uncommons in blue. Turns out it's probably just the best blue common. 4 mana 3/2 isn't great, but triggering raid really isn't all that hard. Blue has lots of evasive creatures, and chances are good that you have a profitable attack to make on turn 4, whether your opponent trades or does something else. Then you can play the Hauler and bounce one of your opponent's other creatures, which will really ruin your opponent's day. It also happens to be a pirate, so obviously it gets bonus points for that. It also works really well with bounce and flicker effects, of which there are a few in this format. My dream is going to be casting Siren's Ruse on this. In the end, I think this is an excellent common, worth taking early. I think it's a solid B. Next, we have Expel from Orazca, which for 1 generic and 1 blue is an instant at uncommon. It has Ascend, which is the only new mechanic in this set, and it's an interesting one because it's a state that you can reach, basically. If you control 10 or more permanents, you get the City's Blessing for the rest of the game. You have to play a card with Ascend to get the City's Blessing, but once you do, you keep it forever, whether or not you drop below 10 permanents or whatever. And generally, the cards with Ascend give you an extra bonus if you happen to have the City's Blessing. And in this case, Expel from Orazca says, return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. If you have the City's Blessing, you may put that permanent on top of its owner's library instead. We see disperse effects a lot, and they are always very playable. About a C+, maybe just a C. Paying 2 mana to bounce any permanent instant speed is a great way to get ahead on tempo, and this comes with some additional upside that it turns all the way into a time ebb, and doing this at instant speed is actually not something we see very often. Once you're actually putting the card on top of your opponent's library, you are now trading a card for a card and not trading a card for tempo, because your opponent now has to redraw that card. They're not getting a new card, they're getting the same card you just got rid of, so you're trading a card for a card at instant speed for 2 mana, and that is insane. Granted, ascending isn't something that's always going to be attainable. You're not always going to be able to do it, but that adds significant upside to a card that is just already quite good. In the end, I'm going to give this a B-. I think it's first pickable in a lot of packs. Next, we have Flood of Recollection, which for 2 blue mana is an uncommon sorcery, and it says, return target instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. Exile Flood of Recollection. This isn't very good. This is because all it gives you is card selection, not actual card advantage. Card selection isn't a bad thing, but it is when it costs a whole card itself and is reliant on things being in your graveyard. Sure, there will be times where you have super powerful instants and sorceries in your graveyard, and if that's the case, it gets to be a lot better. If your deck has a lot of super powerful instants and sorceries, maybe you think about running this, but most of the time that's just not going to happen. I think this is a D-. You'll play it in a world where you have tons of awesome removal or something, but most of the time just avoid putting this in your deck. Next up, we have Hornswoggle, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant that says, counter target creature spell. You create a colorless treasure artifact token with, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. I am not a huge fan of counter magic in most formats, as I have said in other set reviews, so I apologize if you've heard me talk about this before, but we're going to do it again. It's dangerous to think of counter magic as removal, and many people do. Sure, it can sometimes function that way, especially a hard counter for creature spells, which Hornswoggle is, but what makes it less good than removal is that you have to have the mana up when the card is played for it to actually do something, and having that mana up is a real opportunity cost in many situations, especially if your opponent just plays around it. With regular removal, it doesn't matter if you have the mana up to cast your removal spell when they play the card. There's not a narrow time frame where you have to use the removal. You can untap and use it on your turn. You can't do that with a card like this. This also means you're not contributing to the board state because you're leaving 3 mana up, and that's a dangerous game to play in Limited, especially if your opponent plays around Hornswoggle. This does produce treasure, making it a little better than some other counter spells because it gives you some fixing, but I'm still going to avoid playing this card the majority of the time. Maybe sometimes you side it in against really big scary bombs like the Elder Dragons, or dinosaurs rather. I'm just going to give it a D though. I'm only going to play it in rare situations. Next, we have Induced Amnesia, which for 2 generic and a blue is a rare enchantment, and it says, when Induced Amnesia enters the battlefield, target player exiles all cards from his or her hand face down, then draws that many cards. It also says, when Induced Amnesia is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return the exiled cards to their owner's hand. This is kind of a weird card to evaluate. Obviously, you usually want to target yourself with it, unless somehow you know your opponent has an amazing hand. And it's basically a way of getting you card selection, but really only in the later part of the game. In the early game, you just want to be curving out, and playing a 3-drop enchantment that doesn't have any immediate impact on the game is a dangerous thing to do. In the later game, if you find yourself holding on to 3 or 4 lands, this is actually pretty good, because it can help you outcard your opponent when you're flooding out. It can be some flood insurance. But being so bad in the early game and really in the mid game as well, in a format that seems to be relatively fast, keeps me from giving this anything other than a D. If this format turns out to be slower, I could see this moving up to more of a C, the kind of card a control deck wants to run as sort of late game insurance to avoid flooding, but it's hard to imagine it being more than a D right now. Next up, we have Kitesail Corsair, which for 1 generic and 1 blue is a common human pirate. That's a 2/1, and it says Kitesail Corsair has flying as long as it's attacking. This is a good little common. Between the relevant creature type and its ability to fly when it attacks, which is really all that matters in an aggro deck, right? What it does when it's attacking, it gives you a lot of value for only 2 mana. This is one of the common 2-drops that you would play as many of as you could get in an aggressive deck, especially an aggressive pirate deck. I'm going to give it a C+. I could even see it hedging into being a B- if this format ends up being incredibly aggressive. Next, we have Kumena's Awakening, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a rare enchantment with Ascend, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, each player draws a card, and then it says if you have the City's Blessing, instead only you draw a card. Letting you and your opponent draw an extra card isn't awesome for 4 mana. The good news is that, unlike other similar effects we have seen, you get to take advantage of the extra card first since it triggers on your upkeep instead of on each upkeep. Then, if you manage to get the City's Blessing, it will become a one-sided card draw effect, and it's a card advantage engine that your opponent probably won't be able to beat, making you and your opponent both even on cards for a while and giving you the first crack at using the card rather than your opponent, and the upside of City's Blessing all make me think this seems like a pretty good card. It is still a bit of a risk to drop this on turn 4 instead of a creature in most cases, but this is the kind of card that will eventually just win you the game. Also worth noting, if you're drawing extra cards, you're probably going to be playing more permanents and ascending more quickly, so it synergizes well with itself as some of these ascend cards do. Since this format does look to be relatively fast, I can't give this as high of a grade as I would like, but I think it's still a B-, and I would first pick it in a lot of packs. Not all, not over removal or bombs or something. Next, we have Mist-Cloaked Herald, which for 1 blue is a 1/1 common merfolk warrior, and it can't be blocked. This is the kind of card people frequently overrate. Sure, it's unblockable and can start attacking on turn 2 and just attack forever, right? But the small amount of damage it does just doesn't add up quickly enough for this card to be considered good, or even average, honestly. Sure, it gets some extra bonus points for being a merfolk and for existing in a format with raid, since it can basically always enable it. But those bonus points keep it from being an F. They don't make it into a card you want to be playing all the time. I think I'm going to give it a D. It does carry auras well, if that becomes a thing. Like if you put the new Curiosity on this, obviously that's a pretty ridiculous combo. You can still get blown out pretty hard though. Mist-Cloaked Herald dies to basically everything. But yeah, I just don't like Mist-Cloaked Herald for the most part. I'm going to start it at a D. Next, we have Negate, which is 1 generic and 1 blue for a common instant that says counter target non-creature spell. Well, here we have another card with an interesting and unique design. Okay, I'm obviously kidding. Negate has been reprinted roughly 1 million times and is clearly a card that Wizards likes making sure is in Standard. In Limited, though, it's mostly a sideboard card. Some decks just don't run enough non-creature spells to make this worth mainboarding, though I do think it's like a D as a mainboard card. You can get away with it if you're desperate for another card. It is definitely solid out of your sideboard, though, especially against someone who's having fun with hugely powerful instant and sorcery spells, where paying 2 mana to counter it gives you a huge tempo boost. Basically, anytime you are playing blue, you would like to pick up one of these for your sideboard, but avoid mainboarding it if you can. It's a solid C out of the sideboard. Next, we have Nezahal Primal Tide, which is 5 generic and 2 blue for a 7/7 legendary creature Elder Dinosaur at rare. It's the blue member of the Elder Dinosaur cycle, and it has a massive text box. Whether or not that text box actually matters will remain to be seen, First off, it can't be countered. You have no maximum hand size. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you get to draw a card, and you can discard 3 cards and exile Nezahal and return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control at the beginning of the next in-step. Yeah, that's a lot of stuff. For 7 mana, it gives you some value. The fact it can't be countered isn't going to come up all that often, but making it so that you draw a card anytime your opponent casts a non-creature spell is nice, and the fact that you can cash cards in to help Nezahal avoid removal is pretty good too. However, I don't think it really does enough at 7 mana to be a legit bomb. It doesn't have evasion of any kind, for example, and sure, it brings a big body and some nice text, but ramping to 7 in this format is a dangerous game, and this isn't the kind of payoff that makes it worth it a lot of the time. Sure, it's an okay finisher in a legit control deck, but will there be a legit control deck in this format on a regular basis? I don't think so. I hope there are, but I'm going to start this at C+. It might have a ton of text, but most of it just isn't super relevant. Next, we have Release to the Wind, which for 2 generic and a blue is a rare instant that says, exile target non-land permanent. For as long as that card remains exiled, its owner may cast it without paying its mana cost. This is a really cool card. Wizards honestly really impresses me sometimes. The game has been around for 25 years, and yet they find new and interesting ways to design cards. Sure, this is kind of just a glorified flicker effect, but it is way better than that for a ton of reasons. Flicker effects give you no control, really, over when your creature re-enters the battlefield. This does. This card is also very flexible. While not optimal, you can use it on one of your opponent's creatures if they are trying to put an aura on it, or use a combat trick, or if you need to remove it from combat to not die. The more busted thing to do with it is to exile a creature being targeted by removal, or a creature who has a powerful enter the battlefield ability like the Chupacabra. Because this card can do so many different things, I think having one in most blue decks is going to feel good. Problem is it's rare, so you're not going to see it that often. And you definitely want more of them. Again, a rare, so you might not get them, but you definitely want more of them if you end up with lots of cards with enter the battlefield effects, like the Pirate Mana War or the Necrotal Chupacabra. I'm going to give it a C+. Next, we have River Darter, 2 generic and 1 blue for a 2/3 Merfolk Warrior at common, and it can't be blocked by dinosaurs. This is a solid little creature, useful creature type, decent stats, and the ability to attack through dinosaurs are all things that I'll feel fine about having in my Merfolk deck. That said, it's not anything special either, and that's basically a classic definition of a C. Next, we have Riverwise Augur, which for 3 generic and 1 blue is a 2/2 Merfolk Wizard at uncommon, and it says, when it enters the battlefield, you draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. I really love this card. I tell you that so you can know I might overrate it, but I'm doing my best to temper expectations here. A 4-mana 2/2 is horrible stats-wise, but the enter the battlefield effect here is very powerful. Drawing 3 cards and then putting 2 cards from your hand on top of your library both gives you card selection and card advantage, and can go a long way to finding you what you need in your smaller limited deck. It also comes with a useful creature type, as a Merfolk, and exists in a format that has several ways of bouncing and blinking creatures, so you might get to do it more than once. I mean, it's going to be a 2-for-1 most of the time because you're netting 1 card, and then it can just block an X2. And all of that means I think it's a first pickable uncommon, and I'm going to give it a B-. If this format turns out to be substantially slower than Triple Ixalan, this could become the best blue uncommon, potentially. But because, playing a creature that's this underwhelming might be a little dangerous in Ixalan, it's hard to give it anything higher than a B-. Next, we have Sailor of Means, which is 2 generic and 1 blue for a 1/4 human pirate at common that gives you a treasure when it comes into play. Here is the blue card in the cycle of weird, underwhelming reprints from Ixalan. It was fine in Ixalan, providing a decent body for blocking as well as fixing and ramping, and a useful creature type, but it was nothing special. It's just a C. You might want to prioritize it a little more if you're trying to splash an off-color bomb. Other than that, it's nothing special. Next, we have Sea Legs, which for 1 blue mana is an enchantment aura at common with flash and enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature gets +0/+2 as long as it's a pirate. Otherwise, it gets -2/-0. This is an enchantment that is basically a combat trick, which can be pretty nice if you have a few cards with Ascend in your deck, since most other combat tricks don't stick around on the battlefield to count as a permanent. That said, what it does isn't all that powerful. Lowering your opponent's power is nice, but it's not going to help you kill the creature. And making your creature's toughness higher is nice, but usually it's also not going to help you win in combat. It's just going to keep your creature alive. Occasionally, yeah, you will actually get to kill a creature, claim a creature with sea legs, but not often enough for it to be awesome. It does have a lot of flexibility, though, and flexibility is nice. I think I'm just going to give it a solid C. I think you'll play one in like every pirate deck and feel okay about it. Next, we have Seafloor Oracle, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 2/3 Merfolk Wizard at rare, and it says whenever a Merfolk you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So obviously this is one of those feast or famine kind of cards in Ixalan where this card's pretty terrible if you don't have a lot of Merfolk and incredible when you have a lot of them. So I give 2 grades to these cards. They're build-arounds basically. There's just a lot of them in Ixalan block. And Seafloor Oracle is one of them. It's an F if you don't have enough Merfolk. But making it so every one of your Merfolk hitting your opponent draws you a card is amazing. I mean, if you remember Bident of Thassa, this has that sort of effect on a game. If your board is already wide when you play this, it's great. Even if you're only getting in with 1 or 2 Merfolk the turn you play it, it's great. Even if you only get in for some damage later and draw cards off of it, that's great. It's a great card for the Merfolk deck. It has a very high ceiling. I'm going to give it a B- in a Merfolk deck. It might even be a solid B. It's worth first picking in weaker packs, even though it's one of these, all or nothing kind of cards where you can't really play it if you end up playing pirates instead of Merfolk. But if you're in Merfolk, it's going to be incredible. Next, we have Secrets of the Golden City, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a common sorcery with Ascend, and it says draw 2 cards. If you have the City's Blessing, draw 3 instead. So 3 mana to draw 2 cards at sorcery speed is already a borderline playable card in most formats. Adding the City's Blessing to this makes it even better. If there's a control deck in this format, this common is going to be one of the big reasons why. Casting this in the late game to draw 3 cards is enough to win you the game in a lot of situations. Still, I have to temper my excitement about this card a little bit because of the fact that fast decks will likely continue to run amok in this format. I'm going to give it a C with the caveat that if you really get there on a control deck, this will probably be one of your key commons. Next up, we have Silvergill Adept, which is a reprint, but part of a new cycle. The other cards in the cycle are all not reprints, but it's a reprint from Lorwyn. And 1 generic and 1 blue for a 2/1 Merfolk Wizard at Uncommon. It says, as an additional cost to cast Silvergill Adept, reveal a Merfolk card from your hand or pay 3. And it also says, when it enters the battlefield, draw a card. So it's going to be excellent in Merfolk decks. It's another sort of feast or famine card. If you don't have enough Merfolk in your deck, paying 5 mana for a 2/1 that draws you a card is horrendous. I don't care that it's drawing you a card. But if you're in a Merfolk deck and consistently just play this on turn 2, draw a card, that is amazing. Like many cards in this set, it's basically an F in a non-Merfolk deck, but I think it's actually gets all the way up to like a B- in a Merfolk deck. Because it's just like an incredible 2-drop. It's got decent stats, it replaces itself. What more could you ask for? Next up, we have Siren Reaver for 3, which is a 3 generic and 1 blue for a 3/2 creature, a Siren Pirate at Uncommon, and it has Raid. If you've attacked with a creature this turn, it costs 1 less mana, and it has Flying. This card's great, and it's nice that it's not, some sort of feast or famine card after the number we've just talked about. A 4 mana 3/2 flyer is about on rate anyway, and would probably get a decent grade, especially on a creature with a useful creature type like Pirate. But the rate trigger means you can potentially play this on turn 3, and that's pretty insane. A 3 mana 3/2 flyer at Uncommon. That is, of course, the optimal situation, but an evasive creature with these stats is good at any stage of the game, especially if you're only paying 3 mana for it. This is one of the better blue Uncommons, and I'm going to start it at B-. Next, we have Slippery Scoundrel, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 human pirate at Uncommon with Ascend. And it says, as long as you have the City's Blessing, Slippery Scoundrel has hexproof and can't be blocked. I don't really like this card. The cards with Ascend that are good are actually decent cards to play with when you don't have City's Blessing. The Scoundrel slips far away from that. A 3 mana 2/2 is just bad. Useful creature type or not, and sure, in the late game it is an unstoppable attacking machine, but it is bad at every other stage of the game. I'm not going to start it at an F, though I can see it ending up there. I am going to give it a D for now, give it a little bit of benefit of the doubt that maybe it can find its way into some very specific decks that find a way to ascend very quickly by making a bunch of treasure or something. Next, we have Soul of the Rapids, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 3/2 elemental at common with flying and hexproof. A big flying creature with hexproof is appealing to me. Doesn't have the best stats ever, but that's okay, since there aren't many removal spells that can target it. Actually, there aren't any that can target it, but there aren't even any that can deal with it. Not many, anyway. Only sacrifice effects or board sweepers. This can just run away with games sometimes when the ground is locked down and your opponent just can't find a creature who can block and kill this thing. Hexproof means this is a good card to slap auras on too, much like Jade Guardian was in Triple Ixalan. All that said, it isn't incredible. You'll probably play one in your average blue deck, but keep in mind all your opponent needs is a 2/2 flyer and they can trade with it, and they might be trading up because you just played a 5-drop. But I'm going to give it a C+. Next up, we have Spirewinder, which for 3 generic and 1 blue is a 2/3 snake at common. It has flying, it has ascend, and if you've ascended, it gets +1/+1, so it's a 3/4. I'm not interested in this card very much either, for much the same reason I wasn't interested in Slippery Scoundrel. A 4-mana 2/3 flyer is definitely better stats than what the Scoundrel offered. At least this has evasion, and it is nice that in the late game it gets boosted up to a 3/4, but it isn't even a blue card you want to play all the time. There are just way better things to be doing with 4 mana. I'm going to give it a C-. Next, we have Sworn Guardian, which for 1 generic and 1 blue is a 1/3 Merfolk Warrior at common. This is a textbook definition of a D. It offers okay stats for 2 mana and a useful creature type, but you're only playing this 2-drop if your curve is looking ugly or you're desperate for more Merfolk, and that means it's a D. Next, we have Timestream Navigator, which for 1 generic and 1 blue is a 1/1 human pirate wizard at Mythic with Ascend, and get ready for this activated ability. For 2 generic and 2 blue, you can tap it, put it on the bottom of your library, and take an extra turn. Activate this ability only if you have the City's Blessing. This card is silly. The dream, of course, is to find a way to mill your whole deck aside from Timestream Navigator and take infinite turns until your opponent is dead. How easy is that going to be in this format? Well, not really. There's not really a lot of ways to mill yourself. But still, using it to just take a single extra turn isn't extremely far-fetched. The City's Blessing isn't really easy to get or anything, but it isn't something you will only rarely obtain either. Worth noting, it does have to survive a turn as a 1/1 on the board to get you your extra turn, and it will certainly be a magnet for removal if you have the City's Blessing, but if you get to activate it even once, you're going to win the game. I'm going to start this at a B. It says take an extra turn on it, and it seems like you're going to be able to do it enough of the time that it's going to be worth it. Next up is Warkite Marauder, which for 1 generic and 1 blue is a rare 2/1 human pirate with flying, and it says whenever Warkite Marauder attacks, target creature defending player controls loses all abilities and has base power and toughness 0/1 until end of turn. This card is super strong and sort of a blue version of a Goblin Heel Cutter effect. I like that they found a way for blue to be aggressive that just feels blue still, and they did that here. It brings you a 2/1 flying body for 2 mana, which is already playable, but on top of that, it turns one of your opponent's creatures into a dud every time it attacks. This is frequently going to enable not only Warkite Marauder to attack, but some of your other creatures to attack as well, since your opponent's best blocker just became a 0/1. Alternatively, it can make sure it can continue to attack in the sky by getting flying blockers out of the way with its ability. This is the ideal kind of 2-drop, great at every stage of the game, and it comes with a useful creature type to boot. The one problem it has is that with only 1 toughness, it does die to pretty much everything, but this thing is still a house. You don't normally think of 2 mana 2/1s as bombs, but this is getting pretty close. I'm going to give it a B+. It is going to be first pickable a vast majority of the time that you see it, and if you get it past you, you should feel overjoyed. Next up is Waterknot, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is an enchantment aura at common with enchant creature, and when it comes into play, it taps enchanted creature, and that creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. This is sort of a classic blue removal spell at common. Tapping creatures down in this format is enough to shut down most of them. Being an enchantment-based removal spell also means it helps you build towards ascending, but it has the downside of also not keeping your opponent from ascending. Creatures with static or activated abilities are always a problem for removal spells like this, even after you tie them in your Waterknot. Still, it's a good removal spell. I think it falls a little short of premium for me, and I'm going to give it a C+. Well, that's the last blue card in Ixalan. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you disagree with any of my ratings, let me know in the comments, and if you want to make sure you catch a lot more Rivals of Ixalan content, including the rest of this limited review, don't forget to subscribe. Also, don't forget to come back tomorrow for my thoughts on every black card in Rivals of Ixalan. Thanks for watching.